Sometimes the things we inherit aren't the treasures we thought we wanted. Sometimes they're the gifts we never knew we needed. When 52-year-old naturalist Maren Brooks loses her beloved grandfather, she inherits what her family dismisses as worthless: a tiny, rocky island off Michigan's northern coast with nothing but a weathered cabin and a mysterious boulder. Her siblings quickly claim the valuable lakefront properties, leaving her with what they consider junk. Burned out from demanding city life and quietly nursing the wounds of a painful divorce, Maren retreats to the isolated island with only her loyal German shepherd Scout for company. But when Scout starts digging around that ancient rock, he uncovers something extraordinary, a rich vein of copper ore worth a small fortune. Suddenly, the same family members who mocked her inheritance are arriving with warm smiles and calculating schemes. Will Maren cash in on her unexpected windfall, or will she discover that some inheritances are worth far more than money? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the downtown office building hummed their familiar tune of exhaustion as Maren Brooks stared at yet another environmental impact report. The words blurred together: water table contamination, wildlife displacement, soil degradation. After 15 years as a naturalist consultant, she could recite the corporate doublespeak in her sleep. Companies paid her handsomely to tell them what they already knew. Their projects would damage the environment. They just needed her credentials and signature to make it all legal. Her phone buzzed against the glass desk. Another text from her ex-husband about dividing their remaining assets. Even 6 months after the divorce, Richard couldn't seem to grasp that she didn't want the vacation home in Aspen or the wine collection. She wanted peace, something that had become as rare as the endangered species she spent her days documenting. Scout lifted his graying muzzle from his bed in the corner of her office. The German shepherd had been her constant companion for 8 years, ever since she'd found him as a puppy at the animal shelter. His dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from watching humans make the same mistakes over and over. He was the one constant in her life that made sense. "I know, boy," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I'm tired too." The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Maren was reviewing wetland surveys when her sister Sarah's voice crackled through the phone, brittle with barely contained emotion. "Grandpa's gone, Mare," peacefully, in his sleep. "The funeral is Saturday." The report slipped from Maren's fingers, scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. Grandfather Edmund, steady, kind, unshakable Grandfather Edmund, had been the cornerstone of their scattered family for as long as she could remember. While her parents had divorced when she was 12, and her siblings had drifted into their own complicated lives, Grandpa had remained constant as the Northern Star. The funeral drew the family together like iron filings to a magnet, but the pull felt reluctant, obligatory. The small church in Traverse City, filled with people whose memories of Edmund Brooks painted him as a quiet man who loved the outdoors and kept to himself. Maren sat in the front pew, Scout's warm weight against her leg providing comfort that her family seemed unable or unwilling to offer. Her brother, Daniel, sharp-suited and checking his phone every few minutes, sat with his wife Jennifer, who kept whispering about property values and inheritance taxes. Sarah, ever the lawyer, had already begun discussing the will with their cousin Mark, whose real estate expertise was apparently crucial to maximizing the estate's potential. "The main properties will need to be appraised quickly," Sarah was saying in hushed tones. "The lakefront parcels alone are worth millions in today's market." Maren found herself studying her grandfather's weathered hands, folded peacefully in the casket. Those hands had taught her to identify bird calls, to read the sky for weather changes, to find true north without a compass. They had been gentle hands, patient hands, hands that had built things rather than torn them down. After the service, the family gathered at Sarah's house for the reading of the will. The attorney, a soft-spoken man who had known their grandfather for decades, spread the documents across the dining room table with careful reverence. Edmund was very specific about his wishes. He began, adjusting his reading glasses. The main lakefront property, including the house and 40 acres, goes to Daniel. The southern cabin and 25 acres go to Sarah. The timber rights and northern acreage go to Mark. Maren waited, but her name didn't come. The silence stretched awkwardly until the attorney cleared his throat. To my granddaughter Maren, who has always seen the true value in simple things, I leave the island. The island. Daniel looked up from his phone for the first time all day. You mean that pile of rocks out in the middle of nowhere? Birch Island, the attorney confirmed. 3 acres, including the old cabin and all structures thereon. Sarah laughed, but it wasn't entirely unkind. Oh, Mayor, that old place hasn't been habitable in years. There's nothing out there but that weird boulder and Grandpa's fishing shack. It's not even accessible except by boat, Jennifer added helpfully. And the property taxes alone. I'll take it, Maren said quietly. The room fell silent. Daniel looked at her as if she'd announced plans to move to Mars. Mayor, be reasonable. There's nothing of value out there. We could probably get you a few thousand if we sold it to some developer looking for... I said I'll take it. Scout, who had been lying quietly by her feet, lifted his head and regarded the room with what Maren could only describe as approval. 2 weeks later, she stood on the dock in Leland, Michigan, loading supplies into her grandfather's old fishing boat. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the leaves along the shore blazed in shades of gold and crimson. Scout sat patiently in the bow, his ears pricked forward as if he could already smell their destination. The boat motor coughed to life, and Maren guided them away from the dock and into the vast expanse of Lake Michigan. The water stretched endlessly toward the horizon, grey-green and restless under the autumn sky. She had made this journey only a handful of times as a child, always with her grandfather at the helm, his steady voice pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the lake's moods. Birch Island appeared gradually through the morning mist, exactly as she remembered it, a small rise of rocky ground, crowned with white birch trees and a handful of sturdy pines. The cabin, weathered silver by decades of wind and rain, perched near the island's highest point like a ship's cabin riding out an eternal storm. She beached the boat on the narrow strip of sand and gravel that served as the island's only shore. Scout leapt out immediately, nose to the ground, investigating scents both familiar and new. The air smelled of pine needles, lake water, and something else, something clean and wild that she had forgotten existed. The cabin was smaller than her memory had painted it, but solidly built. Her grandfather had constructed it himself in the 1960s, using timber from the island and stones from the shore. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it. Simple furniture, a wood stove, kerosene lamps, and shelves lined with books about birds, weather patterns, and Great Lakes history. On the wooden table near the window sat a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by countless handlings. Maren opened it carefully, and her grandfather's familiar handwriting filled the pages, decades of observations about the island's wildlife, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. May 15th, 1987, saw the first osprey of the season. Built nest on the tall pine near the north shore. Fish are running well. September 3rd, 1995. Storm from the northwest brought unusual cloud formations. Barometric pressure dropped faster than I've ever recorded. The old boulder seemed to sing in the wind. June 20th, 2003. Maren helped me catalogue the wildflowers today. She has her grandmother's eye for detail and her own gift for seeing what others miss. The island speaks to her. Page after page revealed her grandfather's deep connection to this place, his careful documentation of every bird migration, every weather pattern, every subtle change in the island's ecosystem. But scattered throughout were stranger entries, references to the old stories that the indigenous fishermen had told him, mentions of the island's deeper secrets, and cryptic notes about geological surveys from the 1800s. October 10th, 2010, found another piece of that green-blue rock near the big boulder. The old Ojibwe fisherman was right about this place. Some treasures are meant to stay hidden. Maren closed the journal and looked out the window toward the mysterious boulder that dominated the island's center. It stood nearly 8 feet tall and twice as wide, its surface weathered into smooth curves that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. Her grandfather had always called it the Guardian. Though he'd never explained what it was guarding, Scout had been exploring while she read. And now he returned to the cabin with his tail wagging and something in his mouth, a piece of driftwood worn smooth by the lake. But as she looked closer, she realized it wasn't driftwood at all. It was a piece of metal, green with age and perfectly smooth. She took it from Scout and held it up to the window light. The metal had an unusual weight and a distinctive blue-green patina that seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. That night, as she prepared her simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, Maren felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The cabin's small space felt like a sanctuary, and Scout's contented sighs from his place by the wood stove confirmed that he, too, had something special here. She opened the journal again and continued reading by lamplight. Her grandfather's observations grew more detailed and more personal as the years progressed. He wrote about missing her grandmother, about watching the mainland's development creep closer to the lake, about his growing concern for the natural world that seemed to be disappearing acre by acre. March 22nd, 2018. The mining companies are sniffing around the area again. They remember the old copper boom and think there might be more to find. They don't understand that some things are more valuable left alone. July 4th, 2020. Maren called today. She sounds lost, like she's forgotten who she is underneath all that corporate nonsense. This place could help her remember. The island has a way of showing people what really matters. December 1st, 2023. My health is failing, but the island endures. I hope Maren will understand why I'm leaving this to her. She's the only one who might see its true worth. Maren set down the journal and stared into the dancing flames of the wood stove. Outside, the lake lapped gently against the shore, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone. But instead of the loneliness being oppressive, it felt like freedom. Scout lifted his head and regarded her with those wise, dark eyes. "What do you think, boy?" she asked softly. "Think we could make a go of it out here?" His tail thumped once against the floor, which she chose to interpret as wholehearted approval. As she prepared for bed in the cabin's small loft, Maren realized that for the first time since her divorce, she wasn't dreading tomorrow. The island held mysteries she was only beginning to uncover, and her grandfather's journal promised answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. Outside, the great boulder stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, keeping its ancient vigil. Whatever secrets it held, Maren sensed that she was finally ready to discover them. 3 days on the island had settled into a rhythm that Maren's city-weary soul desperately needed. She woke with the sun, made coffee on the wood stove, and spent her mornings reading her grandfather's journal while Scout patrolled the shoreline. The afternoons were for exploration, cataloguing the island's plant life, watching migrating birds, and slowly acquainting herself with every corner of her inheritance. The peace was profound. No phone calls, no emails demanding immediate attention, no meetings about environmental impact reports that everyone would ignore anyway. Just the endless conversation between wind and water, the rustle of birch leaves, and Scout's occasional bark when he discovered something particularly interesting. On the 4th morning, that rhythm changed. Maren was making her usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee when she noticed Scout behaving strangely. Instead of his normal patrol of the shoreline, he kept returning to the base of the great boulder, circling it with intense concentration. His behavior reminded her of the way he'd acted as a puppy when he'd buried a bone and then couldn't quite remember where. "What is it, boy?" she called from the cabin doorway. "Find something interesting." Scout looked up at her, then back at the boulder, then began digging with renewed determination. His powerful paws sent sprays of dirt and small stones flying behind him as he worked at a spot where the boulder met the earth. Curious, Maren finished her coffee and walked over to investigate. Scout had already excavated a hole nearly a foot deep, and his digging had exposed something that didn't belong in the soil, a piece of old brass, green with verdigris but still solid, easy. "Scout, let me see what you found." She knelt beside him and carefully brushed away the loose dirt. The brass object was rectangular, about the size of her palm, with something etched into its surface. As she cleaned it more thoroughly, she realized it was a collar tag, but not a modern one. This was heavy, well-made, with hand-engraved lettering that had weathered but remained legible. Ranger E. Brooks, N45°23.847, W085, Digi 54.231. The coordinates meant nothing to her, but the name sent a chill down her spine. Ranger had been her grandfather's dog from decades ago, long before Maren was born. She'd seen pictures of the German Shepherd in family albums, a dignified animal with intelligent eyes that reminded her strongly of Scout. But what were coordinates doing on a dog's collar from the 1960s? And why was the tag buried here at the base of the boulder? Scout, meanwhile, had continued digging, and his efforts had uncovered something else. At first, Maren thought it was just another rock, but as she pulled it from the loose soil, she realized it was different from anything else she'd seen on the island. The stone was roughly the size of her fist, with a distinctive blue-green coloration that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. The weight surprised her. It was much heavier than it should have been for its size. The surface was streaked with veins of bright green and copper-colored metal that caught the sun like jewelry. "What in the world?" she muttered, turning the stone over in her hands. A memory stirred from her college geology courses. That distinctive blue-green color, the unusual weight, the metallic streaks. Could this be copper ore? Real copper ore? But that seemed impossible. Copper mining in Michigan had died out more than a century ago, and certainly not on tiny islands in the middle of Lake Michigan. Yet as she examined the stone more closely, she became increasingly certain of what she was looking at. The implications hit her slowly, like ripples spreading across still water. If there was copper ore here, if there was enough of it to be valuable, then her worthless inheritance might be anything but worthless. She looked up at the boulder towering above her, seeing it with new eyes. What if it wasn't just a boulder? What if it was an outcropping of something much larger beneath the surface? Scout had lost interest in digging and was now exploring the shoreline, but Maren remained kneeling by the hole, turning the piece of ore over and over in her hands. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more startling than the last. The coordinates on Ranger's collar tag, they had to mean something. Her grandfather had been methodical about everything. He wouldn't have engraved random numbers on his dog's collar, and the location where Scout had found both the tag and the ore couldn't be coincidence. She pulled out her phone, grateful that she'd paid for the expensive satellite service that gave her internet access even here. The GPS coordinates from the collar tag led to, she blinked and checked again, a spot less than 50 yards from where she was sitting. Following the phone's GPS, she walked northeast from the boulder, Scout trotting alongside her with his tail wagging. The coordinates led to an unremarkable patch of ground near a cluster of young birch trees. But when she knelt and brushed away the fallen leaves, she found disturbed earth, as if someone had dug here before and carefully covered their tracks. Using a piece of driftwood as a makeshift shovel, she began to excavate. 6 inches down, her improvised tool struck something hard. More careful digging revealed another piece of ore, larger than the first, with the same distinctive coloration and metallic veins. Then another, and another. Within an hour, she had uncovered 7 pieces of copper ore, ranging from the size of golf balls to one specimen as large as a football. Each piece was beautiful in its own way. The blue-green patina shot through with veins of pure copper that gleamed like liquid metal in the sunlight. Maren sat back on her heels, surrounded by her treasure trove, and tried to process what she was looking at. This wasn't just a few random pieces of pretty rock. This was evidence of a significant mineral deposit, possibly worth. She didn't even want to think about how much it might be worth. But as the initial excitement faded, other emotions took its place. Confusion first. Why hadn't her grandfather ever mentioned this? He'd lived on this island for decades, had documented every bird migration and weather pattern in meticulous detail, but had never written a word about a copper deposit. Then suspicion. If he'd known about this, why had he kept it secret? And why leave the island to her without explanation? Finally, a growing unease that had nothing to do with the ore itself and everything to do with what its discovery might mean. Her family had laughed off her inheritance as worthless. Daniel and Sarah had been so eager to claim the valuable properties that they hadn't even questioned why their grandfather would leave her an island that seemed to have nothing to offer. But what if they found out? What if word got out that Birch Island contained valuable mineral deposits? Her peaceful retreat would become a battleground, and the island's pristine ecosystem would be threatened by mining interests. Scout returned from his explorations and settled beside her, his warm presence grounding her spiraling thoughts. She scratched behind his ears and looked out across the lake, where the afternoon sun was painting the water in shades of gold and copper, colors that now carried new meaning. "What do you think, boy? What would Grandpa want me to do with this?" Scout's response was to rest his heavy head against her leg, offering comfort without judgment. But Maren's mind continued to race with questions that had no easy answers. The ore samples lay scattered around her like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Each piece was beautiful, potentially valuable, and completely unexpected. But they also represented a choice she wasn't ready to make, between financial security and the peaceful sanctuary she was only beginning to appreciate. As the sun began to set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Maren carefully gathered the ore samples and carried them back to the cabin. She arranged them on the wooden table next to her grandfather's journal, where they caught the lamplight and seemed to glow within a fire. The brass collar tag lay among them, its engraved coordinates now taking on the weight of a map to hidden treasure. But treasure for whom? And at what cost? That night, as Scout dozed by the wood stove and the lake whispered against the shore, Maren found herself staring at the samples and wondering if some discoveries were meant to remain buried. Her grandfather had been a man of deep convictions about preserving the natural world. Would he have wanted her to uncover this secret? Or had he spent decades keeping it hidden for reasons she was only beginning to understand? Outside, the great boulder stood sentinel in the darkness, keeping whatever secrets lay beneath. But now Maren knew that those secrets were more complex and potentially more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Sleep had been elusive. Maren found herself waking every few hours to check on the ore samples, as if they might disappear or transform into ordinary rocks while she wasn't watching. By dawn, she had given up on rest and was sitting at the table with her grandfather's journal and her laptop, determined to understand what she had stumbled into. Her satellite internet connection was slow but functional, and she spent the morning hours researching Michigan's copper mining history. What she discovered painted a picture of boom and bust, of fortunes made and lost, of an industry that had shaped the entire region for decades before fading into memory. The Keweenaw Peninsula, a few hundred miles north of her island, had been the heart of American copper production from the 1840s through the early 1900s. The native copper found there was some of the purest in the world, and mining companies had extracted billions of pounds of the metal from deep underground shafts and open pit mines. But the more she read, the more confused she became. Copper mining had been concentrated far to the north in the Upper Peninsula. There were no records of significant copper deposits in the waters off the Lower Peninsula's coast. Certainly nothing that would justify the rich samples Scout had uncovered, which made her discovery either a complete anomaly or evidence of something that had been deliberately overlooked. She was deep in a historical survey of Great Lakes geology when Scout began barking outside. Looking up from her laptop, she saw him standing at attention near the cabin door, staring at something in the distance. Following his gaze, she spotted a boat approaching the island, the first human contact she'd had since arriving. Panic fluttered in her chest. Had word somehow gotten out about her discovery? She quickly gathered the ore samples and stashed them in a wooden crate behind the wood stove, then stepped outside to greet her visitor. The boat turned out to belong to Tom Whitehorse, an elderly Ojibwe fisherman who had known her grandfather for decades. Maren remembered him vaguely from childhood visits, a quiet man with kind eyes and hands that seemed to understand the lake's moods. "Hello, Maren," he called as he beached his boat. "Thought I'd check on you, see how you're settling in." "Tom, it's good to see you," she meant it. His presence felt like a connection to her grandfather, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone out here. They sat on the cabin's small porch, sharing coffee and conversation. Tom spoke about the weather, the fishing, the changes he'd seen over his 70-plus years on the lake. His words carried the same measured cadence she remembered from her grandfather, the unhurried wisdom of men who had learned to read the world through patient observation. "Your grandfather was a good man," Tom said, gazing out at the boulder. He understood that some things are more important than money. The comment seemed casual, but something in Tom's tone made Maren look at him more closely. "What do you mean?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying the weathered planks of the porch. "The old ones, my grandparents' generation, they used to tell stories about this island, said it was a sacred place, that the spirits had hidden something valuable here to test people's hearts. Stories. Every culture has them. Places where the earth holds secrets, where men are tempted to take what isn't meant to be taken." He gestured toward the boulder. "That rock there, the old fisherman called it the Keeper, said it watched over something precious." Maren felt her pulse quicken. "Did my grandfather know these stories?" Tom smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. Edmund knew everything that mattered about this place. He was a wise man, patient. He knew when to act and when to wait. After Tom left, promising to check on her again in a few days, Maren returned to her research with renewed urgency. But instead of looking online, she turned her attention to her grandfather's belongings, searching for any hint that he had known. About the copper deposit, she found what she was looking for tucked between the pages of a 1960s field guide to Great Lakes birds, a piece of paper so old and water-stained that she almost missed it entirely. But when she unfolded it carefully, her breath caught. It was a surveyor's map, hand-drawn and dated 1883. The coastline was recognizable, though the modern landmarks were absent. But what made her heart race were the red X marks scattered across the map, with notations in faded ink: rich ore deposits, copper vein, high grade, native specimens, excellent quality. And there, clearly marked with a large red X, and the notation, Birch Island, significant deposit, deep shaft recommended, was her inheritance. The map included a legend that documented the survey findings in precise detail. According to the surveyor's notes, Birch Island contained an estimated 200,000 pounds of recoverable copper ore, with samples showing 85% purity, extraordinarily high for natural deposits. Maren sank into her chair, the map trembling in her hands. 200,000 pounds of copper at current market prices would be worth millions of dollars. Millions. But the questions multiplied faster than the calculations. If this survey was legitimate, why had the island never been mined? Why had her grandfather hidden this map instead of acting on it? And why had he left the island to her without explanation? She needed expert advice, someone who could help her understand both the geological and historical implications of what she'd found. Her phone's contact list yielded a name from her consulting days: Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a geologist at the University of Michigan who specialized in mineral deposits. The call took several minutes to connect through the satellite service, but Rebecca's familiar voice finally crackled through the speaker. "Maren, what a surprise. How's the hermit life treating you?" "It's been educational. Listen, Becca, I need some advice. Hypothetically, if someone found copper ore samples on a Lake Michigan island, what would that mean?" There was a pause. Hypothetically, it would be very strange. Copper deposits in that region are virtually unknown. Where are these hypothetical samples located? Maren chose her words carefully. Lower Peninsula, offshore island. The samples show high copper content, very pure. That's unexpected. Copper formation requires specific geological conditions that aren't common in that area. Could you describe the samples? Blue-green coloration, metallic veining, significant weight, and they were found near a large rock formation that might be an outcropping. Rebecca's voice sharpened with professional interest. Maren, are you serious about this? Because what you're describing sounds like native copper, which would be extremely valuable. If there's enough of it, how valuable are we talking about? Current market price for copper is around $4 per pound, but native copper, especially high-grade samples, could command premium prices from collectors and industry. If you're talking about a significant deposit, Rebecca paused, we could be looking at substantial value. But you'd need proper geological surveys, environmental assessments, mining feasibility studies. What about environmental impact? Maren interrupted. That's the big question. Copper mining is extremely disruptive. Open pit mining, chemical processing, groundwater contamination. It's not pretty. Any significant deposit would attract major mining interests. And once they get involved, Rebecca's voice trailed off meaningfully. After ending the call, Maren sat in the cabin's growing twilight, surrounded by evidence of a discovery that could change her life forever. The ore samples gleamed in the lamplight, beautiful and tempting. The surveyor's map promised wealth beyond her wildest dreams. But Tom's words echoed in her memory. Some things are more important than money. She opened her grandfather's journal again, looking for clues about his state of mind, his motivations for keeping this secret. Near the back, she found an entry dated just months before his death. The developers are circling like vultures now, waiting for me to pass so they can convince the family to sell. They don't understand what they'd be destroying. This island isn't just land. It's a living system, a refuge for species that are disappearing elsewhere. The copper has been here for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer. The entry continued. I'm leaving the island to Maren because she's the only one who might understand. The others see dollar signs where they should see responsibility. She sees the world the way her grandmother did, with eyes for beauty rather than profit. I pray she'll make the right choice when the time comes. As if responding to her grandfather's memory, Scout padded over and rested his head on her knee. Outside, the lake lapped gently against the shore, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called its ancient question into the night. Maren looked at the ore samples, then at the map, then out toward the boulder silhouetted against the starlit sky. For the first time since her discovery, she was beginning to understand the true weight of her inheritance, not just the potential value of what lay beneath the island, but the responsibility of deciding what that value was worth. The morning after her call with Rebecca, Maren found herself drawn to explore the cabin more thoroughly. She had been so focused on settling in and then on her discovery that she hadn't truly examined her grandfather's belongings. Now, with questions multiplying about his motivations and the island's history, she felt compelled to search for more clues. In a small wooden chest tucked beneath the bed, she discovered a collection of family heirlooms that her grandfather had apparently kept on the island. Each item was wrapped carefully in soft cloth, preserved with the same meticulous care he'd given to everything in his life. There were photographs, black and white images of relatives she'd never met, sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had carved out lives in Michigan's wilderness. A pocket watch that had belonged to her great-grandfather, its brass case worn smooth by generations of handling. A small leather Bible with pages so thin they were nearly transparent, filled with margin notes in different hands spanning decades. But it was the locket that took her breath away. The piece was clearly old, its silver surface darkened with age, but still elegant in its simplicity. Inside, she found a tiny photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, standing in front of what was unmistakably the island's boulder. But the image showed the boulder in its natural state, surrounded by wildflowers and unmarked by any signs of human exploration. Opposite the photograph was a pressed four-leaf clover, so old it was barely more than a green shadow on the locket's interior, but somehow perfectly preserved. On the back of the locket, an inscription had been engraved in flowing script: "True wealth lies in what cannot be bought. EMB, 1943, Elena Marie Brooks," her great-grandmother, whose stories had filled Maren's childhood with tales of strength and wisdom. Elena had been a teacher, a woman who had raised 5 children during the Depression while her husband worked in the lumber camps. She had been the one to instill in their family a reverence for the natural world, a belief that some things were sacred and should remain untouched. Maren fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her chest like a gentle reminder of values that ran deeper than profit margins. The inscription seemed to pulse with relevance. True wealth lies in what cannot be bought. Her contemplation was interrupted by her phone ringing. The caller ID showed her cousin Mark's number, which surprised her. Mark was Sarah's younger brother, a real estate developer who rarely called unless he needed something. "Hey, Mare, how's island life treating you?" His voice carried forced cheerfulness that immediately put her on guard. "It's peaceful, Mark. What can I do for you?" "Oh, just checking in. Family should stick together, you know. Sarah mentioned you might be feeling a little isolated out there. We've been thinking maybe you'd like to come back to civilization for a while. Stay with Jennifer and me until you figure out your next move." Maren walked to the window and looked out at Scout, who was lying near the boulder in a patch of morning sunlight. "I'm not planning any moves. I like it here, but Mare, be practical. You can't live out there year-round. No heat, no internet, no medical facilities nearby. What if something happens? I have satellite internet and the wood stove works fine. As for medical emergencies, I'm probably safer here than I was crossing downtown Chicago every day." There was a pause. "Look, I've been doing some research on island properties in the area. You know, just curious about what Grandpa left you. Some of these lake parcels are worth more than people realize. If you ever wanted to sell—" "I'm not selling, Mark. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying you have options. Sarah thinks maybe Grandpa didn't realize how valuable waterfront property has become. You could probably get enough to buy a nice condo somewhere warm, maybe invest the rest. Live comfortably without having to work those corporate consulting jobs you hate." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mark becoming increasingly insistent about his concern for her welfare. By the time she hung up, Maren felt drained and vaguely nauseated. The call had been fishing expedition, poorly disguised as family concern, but how had Mark known she hated her consulting work? She'd never discussed her career dissatisfaction with him, unless her family had been talking about her situation more than she realized, analyzing her life and making decisions about what was best for her. Scout seemed to sense her agitation. He trotted over from his sunny spot and pressed against her legs, offering comfort in his direct, uncomplicated way. But when she looked out toward the boulder, she noticed something that made her frown. Scout's behavior around the great rock had changed since her discovery. Instead of his usual casual exploration, he now seemed to patrol the area with deliberate intensity. He would circle the boulder several times each day, sniffing at the base, sometimes sitting vigil beside it, as if standing guard. "What is it, boy? What do you sense out there?" As if in response to her question, Scout walked to the cabin door and waited for her to follow. She clipped on his leash, more from habit than necessity on the island, and let him lead her outside. He headed straight for the boulder, but instead of his usual investigative sniffing, he positioned himself between Maren and the rock formation, his body tense and alert. His behavior reminded her of the way he'd acted when strangers approached her apartment in the city. Protective, wary, ready to defend if necessary. "Are you protecting it, Scout, or protecting me from it?" The distinction seemed important, though she couldn't articulate why. The boulder loomed above them, its weathered surface giving no hints about the secrets it held. But standing this close, Maren could see details she'd missed before, subtle variations in the rock's coloration, veins of different minerals threading through the granite, and what looked like tool marks near the base. Tool marks. Someone had worked on this boulder before, had shaped it or excavated around it. The marks were old, weathered nearly smooth, but they were definitely human-made. Her great-grandmother's locket seemed to grow heavier around her neck, the inscription taking on new weight. Elena had lived through the Depression, had watched families torn apart by economic desperation, had seen what the pursuit of wealth could do to people who lost sight of what truly mattered. Maren thought about Mark's phone call, about the subtle pressure in his questions, about the way her family had dismissed her inheritance until they started thinking about its potential value. She thought about Rebecca's description of copper mining, the environmental destruction, the industrial contamination, the permanent transformation of pristine landscapes into scarred earth. Then she looked around at the island as it was now, the birch trees stirring in the lake breeze, the wildflowers that had somehow survived in the thin soil, the perfect silence broken only by the gentle lapping of waves and the distant cry of a loon. For the first time since her discovery, she began to understand why her grandfather might have kept the copper deposits secret. It wasn't about the money, or even about the environmental damage, though that would have mattered to him. It was about something more fundamental, the recognition that some things were worth more than their market value. The island existed in perfect balance, a small sanctuary where natural systems could function without human interference. The copper had waited beneath the boulder for thousands of years. It could wait longer, but if word got out about its presence, that balance would be destroyed forever. That evening, as she prepared dinner by lamplight, Maren opened her grandfather's journal to a page she'd overlooked before. The entry was dated just a year after Elena's death in 1987. Mother always said that every generation faces a test of character, a moment when they must choose between what they want and what they know is right. She faced hers during the Depression, when the land company offered to buy our farm for lumber. Dad wanted to sell. We needed the money desperately. But Mother convinced him to hold on, to find another way. She said some things, once lost, can never be recovered. I think I understand now why she gave me this locket before she died. It wasn't just a family heirloom, it was a reminder. True wealth lies in what cannot be bought. The island is my test, and someday it will be someone else's. I pray that when the time comes, they'll have the wisdom to choose preservation over profit. Maren touched the locket at her throat, feeling the connection across generations, Elena's wisdom, her grandfather's stewardship, and now her own responsibility to carry that legacy forward. Outside, Scout had taken up his evening patrol around the boulder, his dark silhouette moving steadily through the gathering dusk. Whatever instinct drove his protective behavior, Maren was beginning to trust it. Some things were worth guarding, worth keeping safe from a world that measured everything by its potential for exploitation. The ore samples still sat in their hiding place behind the wood stove, beautiful and valuable and completely irrelevant to the peace she felt settling over her like the island's evening mist. Maren was cataloguing wildflower species near the island's northern shore when she heard the boat engine. The sound carried clearly across the water, a powerful motor, not like Tom Whitehorse's weathered fishing boat or the small craft used by the occasional tourist. This was a luxury vessel, the kind that announced its owner's prosperity with every purr of its well-tuned engine. Scout's ears pricked up, and he trotted to the shoreline with his alert stance that meant visitors. Maren followed, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun to make out the approaching boat. Her heart sank when she recognized the sleek cabin cruiser and its familiar pilot. Daniel had always been fond of expensive toys, and his latest boat was no exception, all gleaming chrome and pristine white fiberglass, the kind of vessel that cost more than most people's houses. "Mare!" Daniel called out as he maneuvered the boat toward the island's small beach. "Hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I was in the area and thought I'd check on my favorite sister, Maren forced a smile, though something about his tone set her teeth on edge. Daniel had never called her his favorite anything, and he'd certainly never made unannounced visits to check on her welfare. "Hello, Daniel. This is unexpected." He beached the boat with practiced ease and bounded up the shore with the kind of aggressive good cheer that reminded Maren why she'd always felt uncomfortable around her older brother. Daniel was a successful insurance executive who treated every conversation like a sales pitch and every relationship like a networking opportunity. "Look at you," he exclaimed, giving her an awkward hug that smelled of expensive cologne and boat fuel. "You look great." "Really great. This hermit thing is working for you?" "I'm hardly a hermit. I just appreciate the peace and quiet." Of course. "Nothing wrong with getting away from it all for a while?" "Clear your head. Figure out what's next." He gestured broadly at the island, his gaze lingering on the boulder. "Quite a place Grandpa left you. Very rustic." Scout had positioned himself between Maren and Daniel, not aggressively, but with clear wariness. Daniel either didn't notice or chose to ignore the dog's body language. "Come on, show me around," Daniel said, already walking toward the cabin. "I've only been out here once or twice as a kid. Don't remember much about it." The tour didn't take long. The island was small, and the cabin's simple layout required little explanation. But Maren noticed Daniel paying close attention to details that seemed odd for a casual visit. He examined the boulder extensively, walking around its perimeter and even running his hands over sections of the rock surface. "Interesting formation," he commented. "Wonder what kind of stone this is. Looks almost like it has metal veins running through it." "Just granite," Maren replied quickly. "Common in this region." Daniel continued his examination, and Maren felt increasingly uncomfortable with his scrutiny. "Grandpa ever mention anything special about this rock? Seems like an odd centerpiece for the island. He called it the Guardian, never explained what that meant." "The Guardian," Daniel repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting. Well, you know Grandpa and his stories." They spent another hour on what Daniel called catching up, though the conversation felt more like an interrogation disguised as brotherly concern. He asked detailed questions about her plans, her finances, her long-term goals. When Maren mentioned feeling more peaceful on the island than she had in years, Daniel frowned. "Peace is great, Mare, but you can't live on peace." "What about practical concerns? Winter's coming, and you can't seriously be planning to stay out here when the lake freezes. You'll be completely cut off. I'll figure something out. Look, I'm not trying to be the bossy big brother, but Sarah and I have been talking. We're worried about you. This whole divorce thing hit you hard, and now you're isolating yourself out here with nothing but a dog for company. It's not healthy." "I'm fine, Daniel. Are you?" "Because from the outside, it looks like you're running away from life instead of dealing with it. And this place," he gestured around the island again, "it's not exactly a practical long-term solution. No income potential, constant maintenance needs, property taxes. The property taxes are minimal, for now. But lakefront values are skyrocketing. The tax assessor's going to catch up with reality eventually, and then what? You'll be forced to sell anyway. But by then, you might miss out on the current market peak." Maren felt her patience wearing thin. "I didn't realize you'd become an expert on island property values." Daniel laughed, but it sounded forced. "Just looking out for family. That's what we do, right?" After he left, promising to check in again soon, Maren felt drained and oddly violated. The island that had felt like a sanctuary now seemed exposed, vulnerable to scrutiny and judgment from people who couldn't understand its value beyond dollars and cents. She was cleaning up the coffee cups from their visit when something caught her eye on the cabin floor near where Daniel had been sitting. A small white rectangle, probably fallen from his pocket when he'd pulled out his phone. Maren picked up the business card and felt her blood go cold. North Shore Extraction Corporation, Mineral Rights and Resource Development, the card read in elegant gold lettering. Below that, Marcus Webb, Senior Vice President, Acquisitions. The company's address was in Duluth, Minnesota, and the cardstock was expensive. The kind used by major corporations with serious money behind them. She turned the card over and found handwritten notes in Daniel's familiar scrawl. Birch Island, 3 acres, M. Brooks, owner. Geological survey needed. Potential copper deposits per historical records. The words hit her like a physical blow. Historical records, which meant her family hadn't just stumbled across information about the island's mineral potential, they had been researching it. And geological survey needed suggested they were already planning next steps. Her hands trembling, Maren pulled out her laptop and searched for North Shore Extraction Corporation. What she found made her stomach turn. The company specialized in environmentally conscious mineral extraction, which their website claimed meant using modern techniques to minimize ecological impact. But a deeper search revealed a different story. Environmental groups had filed dozens of lawsuits against North Shore over the past decade. News articles documented contaminated waterways, destroyed habitats, and communities left with poisoned groundwater after the company's environmentally conscious mining operations. One article from Minnesota included before and after photographs of a pristine lake that North Shore had mined for iron ore. The before image showed clear water surrounded by old-growth forest. The after image showed a rust-colored pond surrounded by bare earth and industrial equipment. North Shore Extraction promises restoration after mining operations conclude, the article noted. But environmental scientists question whether meaningful restoration is possible given the scale of ecological disruption. Scout appeared at her side, sensing her distress. He whined softly and pressed his head against her leg, offering comfort she desperately needed. Outside, the sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the water in shades of gold and copper, colors that now seemed ominous rather than beautiful. Her family knew. They had known all along about the island's potential mineral wealth, had probably known before the funeral, which meant her grandfather's decision to leave the island to her hadn't been the random bequest it had seemed. He had chosen her specifically, knowing that Daniel and Sarah would try to exploit the copper deposits, trusting that she would make a different choice. But that also meant every conversation since the reading of the will had been a lie. Mark's phone call about her welfare, Daniel's visit today, probably Sarah's future communications. All of it was manipulation, designed to pressure her into selling or to gather information for their mining scheme. She felt sick, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization of how naive she'd been. While she'd been worrying about keeping her discovery secret, her family had been plotting to exploit it. They had researched mining companies, investigated historical records, and developed plans that would destroy everything her grandfather had worked to preserve. Scout began pacing restlessly around the cabin, his anxiety mirroring her own emotional turmoil. Every few minutes he would stop at the window facing the boulder, his hackles slightly raised, as if he sensed some approaching threat. That night, Maren sat by the wood stove with the business card in her hands, staring at the evidence of her family's deception. The ore samples remained hidden behind the stove, but their secret felt less secure now. If Daniel suspected the island contained valuable minerals, if he was already working with extraction companies, then it was only a matter of time before the pressure escalated beyond friendly visits and concerned phone calls. She thought about her great-grandmother's locket, about the inscription that had seemed so meaningful just days before. True wealth lies in what cannot be bought. Elena had faced her own tests during the Depression, had chosen preservation over profit, even when her family desperately needed money. But Eleanor had faced pressure from strangers, from outside companies trying to buy their land. Maren was facing betrayal from her own family, people who were supposed to care about her welfare, but were actually planning to destroy the place that had given her the first real peace she'd known in years. The business card seemed to burn in her hands, a tangible reminder that her sanctuary was under threat, not from distant corporations, but from the people who shared her blood and her name. Tomorrow, she would have to decide how to respond to that threat. Tonight, she could only sit in the lamplight and mourn the loss of trust she hadn't realized she still possessed. Sarah arrived 3 days later in a chartered boat, accompanied by a captain who clearly had instructions to wait offshore while she conducted her business. Unlike Daniel's impromptu visit, this had the feel of a planned operation, complete with a leather briefcase and the kind of determined expression Sarah wore when she was preparing to win a difficult case. "Maren, we need to talk," she announced without preamble as she stepped onto the beach. Scout's immediate low growl suggested he shared Maren's growing wariness of family visits. "Hello to you too, Sarah. Don't be glib. This is serious." Sarah brushed past Scout, who followed her with obvious disapproval. "We need to discuss your situation here. As your sister and as an attorney, I'm concerned about several legal and practical issues." They settled at the cabin's small table, where Sarah opened her briefcase with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to taking control of every situation. The documents she extracted were neatly organized and clearly prepared in advance. "First, there's the matter of the will itself," Sarah began, spreading papers across the table. "Dad and I have been reviewing Grandpa's final arrangements, and we think there may be grounds to challenge his competency at the time he made these bequests. Sarah, he was completely lucid when, was he, a man in his 80s, isolated out here for months at a time, making decisions that don't align with his previously expressed intentions. He told Dad just 2 years ago that he planned to leave the property to all of us. Equally, maybe he changed his mind. Maybe someone influenced him to change his mind." Sarah's tone carried the razor edge she used in depositions. "You spent a lot of time with him those last few months, making trips up here, having private conversations. A lonely old man, a granddaughter going through a difficult divorce, financial pressures." "Stop." Maren's voice was sharp enough to cut through Sarah's building momentum. "If you're suggesting I manipulated Grandpa into changing his will, you can leave right now." Sarah held up her hands in a gesture of false peace. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm explaining how things might look to a probate judge if we're forced to contest the will, which we'd prefer not to do, obviously. Family legal battles are expensive and ugly, and they rarely end well for anyone." The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Sarah continued arranging documents while Maren struggled to process the transformation of her sister from family member to legal adversary. "However," Sarah continued, "there's a much simpler solution that would benefit everyone. I've had the island appraised by 3 different firms, and the consensus is that you're sitting on a property worth between $8 and $12 million. Maren's breath caught. "That's impossible. It's 3 acres of rocks and trees. Lakefront property values have exploded in the last 5 years. But more importantly, preliminary geological surveys suggest the island may contain significant mineral deposits. Historical mining records indicate substantial copper reserves that were never fully exploited. There it was, confirmation that her family's interest had nothing to do with her welfare and everything to do with the copper she'd discovered. But the mention of geological surveys was new and disturbing." "What geological surveys?" Sarah smiled with practiced insincerity. "Just preliminary assessments based on historical data. Nothing invasive. But the potential is significant enough that North Shore Extraction has expressed serious interest in development rights." "I'm not selling, Sarah. Maren, be realistic. You can't live out here permanently. You have no income, no long-term plan, no practical way to maintain the property. What happens when you get sick? When you get older and can't manage the isolation? What happens when the property taxes triple because the assessed value reflects current market realities?" Sarah pulled out another document. "I've prepared a sale agreement that would give you $4 million immediately, with additional payments based on mineral extraction profits. You could buy a beautiful home anywhere you want, invest the rest, and live comfortably for the rest of your life. And North Shore gets to destroy the island. North Shore uses state-of-the-art extraction techniques. Environmental impact is minimal, and they're required to restore the land when mining operations conclude." Maren thought about the photographs she'd seen online. The rust-colored pond, where a pristine lake had once existed. "I've researched North Shore's environmental record. Their idea of restoration doesn't match mine. You're being emotional instead of practical. This isn't about preserving some fantasy wilderness. It's about securing your financial future. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted you to sacrifice your security for a pile of rocks. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah presenting legal documents, financial projections, and increasingly aggressive arguments about Maren's responsibilities to herself and to the family. When logical persuasion failed, Sarah shifted to emotional manipulation, questioning Maren's judgment, her mental state, and her ability to make rational decisions in the wake of her divorce. By the time Sarah left, promising to return with additional documentation that would make the legal realities clearer, Maren felt battered and exhausted. But she also felt something else, a growing anger at being treated like a child incapable of making her own decisions. That evening, while reviewing her grandfather's belongings for any additional insights into his intentions, she discovered something she had missed before. A small wooden compass tucked into the back corner of a dresser drawer. The compass was clished to a warm glow. The face was traditional, with carefully painted directions and a brass needle that still pointed true north. But it was the inscription on the back that made her breath catch. True north, for Maren, who has always known the difference between what matters and what doesn't. Follow your compass, not their maps. Grandpa, 1995. She'd been 12 years old, the summer after her parents' divorce, when she'd spent 2 months on the island with her grandfather. She remembered that summer vividly now, the way he'd taught her to read the natural signs that indicated weather changes, animal movements, the subtle rhythms of the lake. But most clearly, she remembered the day he'd taught her about true north versus magnetic north. But how a compass could be influenced by metal deposits or magnetic interference, but true north remained constant. In life, he had told her as they sat on the boulder watching the sunset, people will try to convince you that north is wherever they want to go. They'll show you maps that put their destination at the top, their priorities at the center. But you have to find your own true north, Maren. You have to decide what values will guide you when everything else is pointing the wrong direction. She had been too young then to fully understand his meaning, but the compass in her hands now made his words resonate with new clarity. Her family was showing her their maps, legal documents, and financial projections that made their priorities seem like obvious destinations. But her true north had always been different from theirs. That night, unable to sleep, Maren took her laptop outside and began documenting the island's ecosystem in detail. Using her professional training as a naturalist, she catalogued every species she could identify: plants, birds, insects, evidence of small mammals. What she discovered surprised even her. The island supported at least 14 species of native wildflowers, several of which were becoming rare due to shoreline development. The shallow waters around the island served as a nursery for juvenile fish populations that fed much larger areas of the lake. The boulder itself provided nesting sites for several bird species, and the island's position made it a crucial rest stop for migrating waterfowl. In ecological terms, the island was far more valuable as a preserved habitat than as a source of copper ore. But that value couldn't be measured in dollars per pound or calculated on mining company spreadsheets. As she worked, Scout maintained his vigilant patrol around the boulder, occasionally stopping to look out across the dark water as if sensing distant threats. His protective behavior had intensified since Daniel's visit, and now Maren understood why. The island wasn't just under threat. It was under siege by people who saw only its extractable wealth and remained blind to everything that couldn't be sold. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Mark. Family video call tomorrow at 7 p.m. Important decisions to discuss. Please join us. The message's polite phrasing couldn't disguise its true nature, a summons to what would undoubtedly be a coordinated effort to pressure her into compliance. But as she held her grandfather's compass, feeling its solid weight and the truth of its needle, Maren realized that she was no longer the confused, recently divorced woman who had retreated to the island seeking peace. She was Maren Brooks' granddaughter, raised to understand the difference between what mattered and what didn't. And tomorrow, she would show her family that their maps were leading in the wrong direction. The family video call was scheduled for 7 o'clock, but Maren found herself too restless to wait indoors. The compass seemed to grow heavier in her pocket as the afternoon wore on, its inscription echoing in her mind. Follow your compass, not their maps. But what if her compass was pointing toward something she hadn't yet discovered? Scout had been behaving strangely all day, more agitated than she'd seen him since their arrival on the island. He would pace between the cabin and the boulder, occasionally stopping to dig at the base of the great rock formation where he'd first discovered the copper ore. But his digging today seemed different, more purposeful, as if he was searching for something specific rather than simply investigating interesting scents. "What is it, boy?" Maren asked, following him out to the boulder for the third time in as many hours. "What are you trying to find?" Scout sat at the base of the boulder and looked up at her with an expression of obvious frustration, as if he was trying to communicate something important, but lacked the words. Then he began digging again, his powerful paws throwing dirt and small stones in all directions. Maren knelt beside him and examined the area he was excavating. The hole was deeper than his previous efforts, and she could see that he was working around what looked like a metal object embedded in the earth. Not copper ore this time, something manufactured, deliberately placed. Easy. "Scout, let me help." Using a piece of driftwood as a makeshift trowel, she carefully cleared away the loose soil around the object. What emerged was clearly artificial, a circular piece of brass or bronze, about 6 inches in diameter, with what looked like a raised center section. As she cleaned away more dirt, she realized she was looking at some kind of mechanism, possibly a lock or a seal. The center section was designed to accept a key, but not a modern key. The keyhole was small and distinctively shaped, with an unusual pattern that looked almost decorative. Maren stared at it for several moments before the shape's familiarity registered. Her grandfather's compass. She pulled it from her pocket and examined it more closely, paying attention to details she'd overlooked before. The compass had a small protrusion on one side that she'd assumed was decorative, a tiny brass extension that matched the proportions of the keyhole perfectly. With trembling fingers, she inserted the compass into the lock. It fit exactly, settling into place with a satisfying click that suggested precision engineering. When she turned it to the right, she heard a mechanical sound from deep within the boulder, gears turning, weights shifting, metal moving against metal. Nothing visible happened for several seconds. Then a section of the boulder's base, about 3 feet square, shifted slightly inward. The movement was so subtle that she might have missed it if Scout hadn't immediately begun pawing at the displaced stone. Together, they managed to push the stone section inward, revealing that it was actually a carefully concealed dorm. Behind it lay darkness and a musty smell that suggested long enclosed space. But there was also something else, the scent of old paper and metal, the smell of a place where someone had spent considerable time. Maren fetched a flashlight from the cabin and returned to examine their discovery. The entrance led to a chamber that had been carved from the solid rock beneath the boulder, an underground space much larger than seemed possible given the boulder's visible size. The ceiling was low but adequate for a person of average height, and the walls showed evidence of careful construction. Smooth surfaces, reinforced corners, proper drainage channels. But it was the chamber's contents that took her breath away. The space had been converted into a research station, complete with work tables, filing cabinets, and scientific equipment that looked like it had been carefully maintained over decades. Specimen jars lined one wall, filled with preserved examples of local flora and fauna. Charts and maps covered another wall, showing detailed ecological surveys of the island and the surrounding lake area. At the center of the room sat a large desk covered with research notes, photographs, and what appeared to be environmental impact studies. Everything was meticulously organized, labeled, and dated. the life's work of a man who had been documenting and protecting this place in secret for decades. Maren moved to the desk and began examining the documents by flashlight. The earliest papers were dated 1962, just after her grandfather had purchased the island. But these weren't the casual nature observations from his leather journal. These were professional-grade scientific studies, detailed enough to have been published in academic journals. Ecological Survey, Birch Island Ecosystem. 1962-2020 read the header on one thick folder. Inside, she found documentation of species populations, migration patterns, breeding cycles, and environmental conditions spanning nearly 60 years. Her grandfather had been conducting the kind of long-term ecological research that universities and government agencies struggled to fund. But it was another folder that revealed the true scope of his work. Mineral Survey and Environmental Impact Assessment, Copper Deposits. Birch Island. The folder contained detailed geological surveys that confirmed what Maren had suspected. The island contained substantial copper deposits, potentially worth millions of dollars. But unlike the preliminary surveys her family had mentioned, these studies included comprehensive environmental impact projections that painted a devastating picture of what mining would mean for the island's ecosystem. Her grandfather had documented every species that would be affected, every habitat that would be destroyed, every environmental consequence of large-scale mineral extraction. The research was thorough, professional, and damning, a scientific case for preservation that would be impossible to refute. But most remarkable were the time-stamped photographs that showed the progression of his discoveries. Images from the 1960s showed him finding the same copper ore deposits that Scout had uncovered. Photos from the 1970s documented his construction of the hidden chamber, his installation of research equipment, his development of the secret lock mechanism. By the 1980s, the photographs showed a different story. Mining companies conducting preliminary surveys of the area, environmental damage from operations on nearby islands, and her grandfather's growing determination to protect Birch Island from similar destruction. One photograph, dated 1987, showed her grandfather standing next to the boulder with a young girl, Maren herself, during that memorable summer when he taught her about True North. But now she understood that the lesson had been more than metaphorical guidance. He had been testing her values, evaluating her character, determining whether she could be trusted with the island's secrets. At the bottom of the file, she found a sealed envelope with her name written in her grandfather's familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just months before his death. "My dear Maren," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found your way to the truth about this island, just as I hoped you would. The copper deposits are real, and they are valuable. But they are not the island's greatest treasure. For 60 years, I have been documenting the life that flourishes here, species that exist nowhere else, ecological relationships that have developed over millennia, natural systems that function with perfect efficiency when left undisturbed. This island is a library of biological knowledge, a sanctuary for creatures that are disappearing from the developed world. I have watched the mining companies destroy other islands, other habitats, other irreplaceable ecosystems in pursuit of mineral wealth. I have seen the environmental impact reports that promise restoration but deliver only devastation. I could not allow that to happen here, but I am old, and someday this responsibility will pass to someone else. Your siblings see only dollar signs where they should see sacred ground. Your cousins view nature as a commodity to be exploited rather than a treasure to be preserved. But you, Maren, have always understood the difference between what can be bought and what cannot be replaced. The choice is yours now. The copper will make you wealthy, but wealth comes and goes. The island's ecosystem, once destroyed, can never be restored. Choose wisely, my dear granddaughter. Choose with your heart, not your wallet. Choose True North, not their maps. Maren sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by 60 years of careful research and documentation. and finally understood the true nature of her inheritance. This wasn't an accidental bequest or a random distribution of property. It was a carefully planned test, a challenge that would reveal her fundamental values and determine the island's future. Her grandfather had known about the family's mining schemes, had probably anticipated their pressure tactics and legal maneuvering. He had spent decades preparing for this moment, gathering evidence that would support her decision to preserve the island while also giving her the tools to resist their manipulation. The chamber itself was proof of his foresight, a secret repository of scientific evidence that would make the case for preservation impossible to ignore. Every environmental impact study, every species inventory, every ecological relationship documented in meticulous detail added weight to the argument that some things were worth more than their market value. When she finally emerged from the chamber, carefully sealing it behind her, Maren found that the sun was setting over Lake Michigan. Her phone showed several missed calls and urgent text messages about the family video conference. But those seemed irrelevant now. Scout sat beside the boulder as if standing guard over the secrets they had uncovered together. His tail wagged once when he saw her, the satisfied expression of a dog who had successfully completed an important task. "Good boy," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "You knew all along, didn't you? You knew what we needed to find. The video call could wait. Her family's pressure tactics and legal threats could wait. Tomorrow, she would face their coordinated assault with the confidence that came from understanding her grandfather's true intentions and the weight of scientific evidence that supported her choice. Tonight, she would sit by the wood stove and read every document in that underground library, absorbing 60 years of wisdom about the island she had been chosen to protect. Maren spent the night in the underground chamber, reading by the light of her grandfather's research lamps and absorbing 60 years of environmental documentation. But it was in the final folder, tucked behind all the scientific studies, that she found the document that changed everything, a legal addendum to her grandfather's will that she had never seen before. The document was recent, dated just 3 weeks before her grandfather's death, and bore the notarized signatures of 2 witnesses she recognized as longtime family friends. But it was the content that made her hands tremble as she read. Codicil to Last Will and Testament of Edmund Charles Brooks. The document began in formal legal language. I, Edmund Charles Brooks, being of sound mind and body, do hereby add the following amendment to my last will and testament, dated March 15th, 2020. The amendment was specific and unambiguous. The bequest of Birch Island to my granddaughter Maren Elizabeth Brooks is conditional upon her demonstrated commitment to environmental stewardship and preservation of the island's natural ecosystems. Should Maren Brooks choose to sell, lease, or otherwise permit commercial development of Birch Island within 10 years of my death, ownership of said property shall revert to the Michigan Nature Conservancy, along with all mineral rights and development privileges. The legal language continued for several paragraphs, but the essence was clear. Her grandfather had legally bound the island's future to her environmental values. If she chose profit over preservation, she would lose everything, and the island would be protected by an organization with the resources and commitment to resist development pressure. But there was more. The codicil included a sealed section marked to be opened only in the event of legal challenge to this will or coercive action by family members. Given the events of the past week, Maren felt justified in breaking the seal. Inside, she found a letter that revealed the full extent of her grandfather's awareness of the family's schemes. My dear Maren, the letter began, if you are reading this, then your siblings are attempting to force you to sell the island. Probably with the assistance of mining companies who have been circling this property like vultures for decades. I've been aware of their interest since 2018, when North Shore Extraction first contacted me about mineral rights. I've also been aware of Daniel and Sarah's communications with these companies, despite their belief that I was too old and isolated to notice their machinations. What they do not know is that I have spent the last 5 years working with environmental lawyers to ensure that the island's protection extends far beyond my death. The codicil you have discovered is only the first line of defense. If they attempt to challenge your ownership or force a sale through legal manipulation, additional protections will be activated that will make any commercial development permanently impossible. But I hope it will not come to that. I hope you will choose preservation not because of legal constraints, but because you understand the island's true value. I hope you will find the strength to resist their pressure and trust your own moral compass, even when they make you question your judgment and your sanity. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to do what is right despite that fear. Your great-grandmother Eleanor showed such courage during the Depression. Now it is your turn to be tested. I have faith that you will choose wisely. The letter was signed with a postscript that brought tears to her eyes. P.S. Scout's predecessor ranger helped me hide many secrets on this island. I suspect Scout has inherited more than just his ancestor's name. Trust his instincts. They will guide you to what you need to find. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Scout appeared at the chamber entrance, his silhouette backlit by the early morning sun. He had been patiently waiting while she read, maintaining his vigil over the boulder and its secrets. "Come here, boy," she called softly. "Looks like you and I have work to do." Back in the cabin, Maren organized the evidence she would need for the confrontation she knew was coming. The codicil gave her legal protection, but her grandfather's scientific documentation gave her something more valuable: moral authority. No reasonable person could look at 60 years of ecological research and argue that short-term mining profits justified destroying such a unique ecosystem. Her phone had been buzzing with increasingly urgent messages throughout the night. Missed calls from Daniel, Sarah, and Mark. Text messages demanding explanations for her absence from the family video conference. And most ominously, a formal-looking email from Marcus Webb at North Shore Extraction Corporation. Ms. Brooks. The email began, "I understand you are the current owner of Birch Island property in northern Lake Michigan. North Shore Extraction would like to discuss mineral development opportunities that could be financially beneficial for all parties involved. Given the significant value of the deposits in question, time is of considerable importance. I will be in the area next week and would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you in person. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience to arrange a mutually beneficial discussion." The email's polite tone couldn't disguise its underlying message: the mining company was preparing to make a direct approach, bypassing her family's subtle manipulation in favor of straightforward business pressure. Before she could respond to any of the messages, her phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and Maren could practically feel the frustration radiating through the device. "Where the hell were you last night?" Sarah's voice was sharp with anger. "We waited an hour for that call. Daniel flew in from Chicago specifically for that meeting. I was busy." "Busy? Busy doing what? You're on a deserted island with no responsibilities and no obligations. The least you could do is show up when your family needs to discuss important matters. What was so important that it couldn't wait?" Sarah's tone shifted slightly, taking on the measured cadence she used when delivering bad news to clients. "Maren, I'm going to be direct with you because I care about your well-being. We've been in touch with a psychiatric evaluation specialist who works with people going through difficult life transitions. Dr. Harrison has extensive experience with individuals who've made impulsive decisions during periods of emotional stress." The words hit Maren like a physical blow. "You want to have me declared mentally incompetent. We want to make sure you're making rational decisions. Your behavior since the divorce has been concerning, isolating yourself, rejecting practical advice, making choices that don't serve your best interests. Dr. Harrison says that severe life stresses can temporarily impair judgment, and that sometimes family intervention is necessary to protect people from themselves. I'm not mentally incompetent, Sarah. Maybe not. But a court might see things differently, especially if we can demonstrate that you're living in substandard conditions, refusing medical care, and making financial decisions that no reasonable person would make. The island has no proper heating, no emergency medical access, no reliable communication. You're risking your safety for what? Some romantic notion about living off the grid? Maren felt the familiar manipulation tactics washing over her, the questioning of her judgment, the implication that her family knew what was best for her, the suggestion that her choices were evidence of mental instability. But now she had context for their pressure, understanding that their concern was driven by greed rather than genuine care for her welfare. And I suppose you've already found someone willing to testify about my incompetence? Dr. Harrison would need to conduct a proper evaluation, of course, but he's reviewed the available information and expressed concerns about your living situation and decision-making patterns. A court-ordered competency hearing would be in everyone's best interests. It would either confirm that you're capable of managing your affairs, or it would provide the legal framework necessary to protect you from making decisions you might regret later. The threat was clear and immediate. If Maren continued to resist their pressure, her family was prepared to have her declared mentally incompetent and take control of her inheritance through legal guardianship. It was a nuclear option that would destroy their relationships permanently, but they were apparently willing to take that risk for the chance at millions of dollars in mining profits. "How long do I have?" Maren asked quietly. "How long for what?" "How long before you file for the competency hearing?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, probably surprised by Maren's direct approach to the threat. "We're hoping it won't come to that. Mr. Webb from North Shore will be contacting you shortly with a very generous offer. If you accept their proposal, this whole situation becomes moot. You get the financial security you need, the family avoids an ugly legal battle, and everyone benefits from a reasonable business arrangement. And if I refuse their offer, then we'll have to explore other options. Dr. Harrison is prepared to file his preliminary assessment within 48 hours if necessary. Maren, please don't force us to go down this road. Take the meeting with Mr. Webb. Listen to what North Shore has to offer. Make a rational decision based on facts instead of emotions." After hanging up, Maren sat in the cabin's growing silence and considered her options. Her family was preparing a coordinated assault. Legal pressure from Sarah, financial pressure from the mining company, and the nuclear threat of a competency hearing if she continued to resist. They had planned their strategy carefully, covering every angle they could think of to force her compliance, but they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed she was operating from weakness, a recently divorced woman seeking refuge from life's disappointments, vulnerable to manipulation and dependent on their guidance. They had no idea that she possessed legal protections they couldn't override, scientific evidence they couldn't refute, and a moral conviction that had been strengthened rather than weakened by their betrayal. Scout had been watching her throughout the phone conversation, his intelligent eyes tracking her emotional responses with obvious concern. Now he approached and rested his head on her knee, offering comfort and solidarity in the simple way that dogs understood instinctively. "We're going to fight them, aren't we, boy?" she said, scratching behind his ears. "We're going to show them that some things can't be bought, threatened, or stolen." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, a sound of quiet agreement that carried more weight than all of her family's legal maneuvering. That afternoon, Maren spent hours organizing her evidence and preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. She photographed every document in her grandfather's research chamber, creating digital copies that could be transmitted to environmental organizations, legal experts, and media outlets if necessary. She researched Dr. Harrison and discovered that he had a history of providing convenient testimony in contested inheritance cases, usually for families seeking to control valuable assets. Most importantly, she contacted Rebecca Martinez and several other environmental scientists, sending them selected portions of her grandfather's research and asking for their professional assessment of the island's ecological value. Their responses were unanimous. The kind of long-term ecological data her grandfather had collected was scientifically invaluable, and the ecosystem it documented would be impossible to restore if destroyed by mining operations. As the sun set, over Lake Michigan, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, Maren stood beside the boulder with Scout at her side and felt a profound sense of clarity about the battle ahead. Her family could threaten her with competency hearings and legal challenges. North Shore could offer millions of dollars and paint pictures of financial security. But none of their pressure could change the fundamental truth that her grandfather had spent 60 years documenting. Some treasures were worth more than money, and some choices defined who you were at the deepest level. Tomorrow, she would meet with Marcus Webb and give North Shore Extraction Corporation her final answer. Tonight, she would prepare for war. They arrived like an invasion force on a chartered boat that could have carried 30 people but held only 5. Daniel, Sarah, Mark, their cousin Jennifer, and Dr. Harrison, whose presence immediately signaled the seriousness of their intentions. Maren watched from the cabin window as they organized themselves on the beach, Sarah distributing documents from her briefcase, while Dr. Harrison made notes on what appeared to be an evaluation form. Scout's growl was low and continuous, a rumble of disapproval that seemed to emanate from his chest. He positioned himself between Maren and the door, his body tense with protective energy. "I know, boy," Maren murmured, checking to make sure. Her grandfather's documents were safely arranged on the table. "But we're ready for this." Sarah led the group to the cabin, her expression set in the grimly determined lines of someone prepared to win at any cost. Dr. Harrison followed closely behind, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the island's rustic environment. "Maren," Sarah called through the door, "we need to have a family meeting. There are several urgent matters to discuss." "Come in," Maren replied, remaining seated at the table where her grandfather's research materials were carefully arranged. "Though I'm not sure how urgent these matters actually are." The cabin felt crowded with 5 additional people, and Scout's continued growling added an undertone of tension that made everyone except Maren visibly uncomfortable. Dr. Harrison immediately began making notes about what he probably saw as evidence of isolation-induced eccentricity. "First," Sarah began without preamble, "I want you to meet Dr. Harrison. He's here to conduct a preliminary competency evaluation, as we discussed yesterday." "I didn't agree to any evaluation." "The evaluation is voluntary," Dr. Harrison said in the kind of soothing tone that mental health professionals used with agitated patients. "But given your family's concerns about your living situation and recent decision-making patterns, I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we could establish your mental state for the record." "My mental state is fine, but I appreciate your professional opinion about a person you've never met." Daniel stepped forward, clearly impatient with the psychological maneuvering. "Mayor, let's cut through the nonsense. Mr. Webb from North Shore is waiting on their boat just offshore. They've prepared an offer that would set you up for life. $12 million guaranteed, plus royalty payments based on extraction volumes. You could buy a mansion anywhere in the world and never worry about money again." $12 million, Maren repeated thoughtfully. "That's a substantial amount. More than substantial. It's life-changing. And all you have to do is sign a development agreement that gives North Shore mineral rights to the island." "And what happens to the island itself?" Mark answered with the casual tone of someone discussing a routine business transaction. "Standard mining protocols. They'll need to clear the surface vegetation and remove the topsoil to access the copper deposits. The whole operation should take about 18 months, maybe 2 years. When they're finished, they'll restore the area according to state environmental guidelines." "Restore it to what?" "To suitable condition for future development or conservation purposes." Dr. Harrison interjected, apparently viewing this as an opportunity to demonstrate Maren's unreasonable attachment to worthless property. Ms. Brooks, your family has expressed concern that you've developed an unhealthy emotional attachment to this island. It's not uncommon for people experiencing major life transitions to fixate on symbolic objects or places that seem to offer security. But such attachments can become problematic when they interfere with rational decision-making. You think my attachment to this island is unhealthy. I think your willingness to sacrifice financial security for an emotional connection to isolated property suggests some concerning thought patterns. Combined with your self-imposed isolation and rejection of family support, these behaviors could indicate a need for professional intervention. Maren looked around the crowded cabin at faces that had once represented family, but now looked like a board of directors preparing to vote her out of her own life. The betrayal was complete. They had brought a psychiatrist to declare her incompetent, had negotiated with mining companies behind her back, and had apparently convinced themselves that their greed was actually concern for her welfare. Before we go any further, she said quietly, I think you should hear something that Grandpa wanted to tell you. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small digital camera memory card that she had discovered in the deepest section of her grandfather's research chamber. The camera itself had been there too, along with a note explaining that the memory card contained final messages for the family to be shared when they reveal their true intentions. What is that? Sarah asked suspiciously. Grandpa's final video message, recorded just 2 weeks before he died. He wanted to make sure his real wishes were understood if anyone tried to challenge them. Maren inserted the memory card into her laptop and connected it to a small portable projector that her grandfather had left in the chamber. The device displayed the video on the cabin's white wall, and her grandfather's familiar face appeared, seated at the same table where they were now gathered. "Hello, family," Edmund Brooks said from the screen, his voice carrying the gentle authority they all remembered. "If you're watching this video, then you've discovered the truth about Birch Island, and you're probably trying to convince Maren to sell it for mining development." The room fell completely silent, except for Scout's now quiet breathing and the soft hum of the projector. "I want you to know that I've been aware of your interest in the island's mineral value for several years. Daniel, I know about your conversations with North Shore Extraction since 2018. Sarah, I know about the legal research you've been conducting into contested wills and competency challenges. Mark, I know about the property appraisals you've commissioned and the development proposals you've reviewed." Daniel's face had gone pale, and Sarah was staring at the screen with obvious shock. "I also want you to know that I chose to leave the island to Maren, not because I didn't trust the rest of you with valuable property, but because I trusted her to understand what made it truly valuable. For 60 years, I have been documenting and protecting one of the last intact island ecosystems in the Great Lakes. The research I've conducted here would take a university decades to replicate, and the habitat I've preserved supports species that exist nowhere else in the region." Her grandfather's image leaned forward slightly, and his expression grew more serious. "The copper deposits are real, and they are worth millions of dollars. But they have been waiting beneath this island for thousands of years, and they can wait longer. The ecosystem that has developed here cannot wait. Once it's destroyed, it can never be restored, no matter how much money you throw at remediation efforts." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a sadness that made Maren's chest tighten. "I had hoped that by the time you saw this video, you would have already chosen preservation over profit. I had hoped that Maren's example might inspire you to see beyond dollar signs to the real treasure that this island represents. But if you're watching this, then I was probably too optimistic about your capacity for wisdom." The video showed her grandfather reaching for something off camera, then holding up the codicil that Maren had discovered. "This document legally protects the island from commercial development, regardless of who owns it. If Maren chooses to sell to mining companies, ownership reverts to the Michigan Nature Conservancy, and the mineral rights become permanently unavailable for extraction." If you attempt to have her declared incompetent, the same protections apply. If you challenge this will, additional legal safeguards will be activated that will make any development impossible. Sarah was frantically taking notes, but her grandfather's next words stopped her pen in mid-sentence. But more than that, I want you to consider what you're asking Maren to do. You're asking her to destroy something irreplaceable for money that none of you actually need. You're asking her to betray values that our family has held for generations. You're asking her to choose the kind of greed that has already destroyed too much of the natural world. The cabin erupted in noise as everyone began talking at once, but Scout's sudden bark cut through the chaos. Through the window, Maren could see another boat approaching the island, a sleek corporate vessel flying. North Shore Extraction's logo, Marcus Webb from North Shore. Extraction approached the cabin with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was younger than Maren had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of expensive grooming that spoke of substantial corporate success. His smile was perfectly calibrated, friendly but professional, suggesting both competence and trustworthiness. "Ms. Brooks," he said, extending his hand as he entered the crowded cabin. "Marcus Webb, North Shore Extraction. I apologize for the timing, but your family indicated that this would be an opportune moment to discuss our development proposal." Maren shook his hand but remained seated, noting how his presence seemed to energize her family members. Daniel straightened up with obvious relief. Sarah closed her notebook with satisfaction, and even Dr. Harrison appeared more confident, as if the arrival of corporate authority validated their entire intervention strategy. "Mr. Webb," Sarah said, taking charge of the situation with practiced ease, "we've been explaining to Maren the exceptional nature of your offer. $12 million is far beyond anything we initially expected for this property." "Indeed," Webb replied, settling into a chair that Daniel had quickly vacated for him. "Our geological surveys indicate that Birch Island contains one of the richest copper deposits in the Great Lakes region. North Shore is prepared to offer terms that would make Ms. Brooks extraordinarily wealthy, while also providing ongoing royalty payments based on extraction volumes." He opened his briefcase and extracted a thick contract bound in expensive leather. "I brought the development agreement for your review. The terms are quite generous. $12 million upfront, plus 8% of gross mineral value extracted over the life of the operation. Based on our projections, total compensation could exceed $20 million. The numbers hung in the air like incense, seductive and intoxicating. Maren could see the effect they had on her family, the kind of wealth that would solve every financial concern for generations. But she also noticed what Webb hadn't mentioned. "What about environmental impact?" she asked. Webb's smile didn't waver. "North Shore uses cutting-edge extraction techniques that minimize ecological disruption. We're required to file comprehensive environmental impact statements with both state and federal agencies, and our restoration protocols meet or exceed all regulatory requirements." What would restoration actually involve? Standard industry practices: soil replacement, erosion control, replanting with native species appropriate to the region. The entire process is overseen by environmental engineers who specialize in post-mining rehabilitation. Maren stood up and walked to the table where her grandfather's research was arranged. "Mr. Webb, have you reviewed the ecological data for this island? Our environmental consultants conducted preliminary assessments based on available information." "Available information," Maren repeated. "Would you like to see 60 years of comprehensive ecological research conducted by a professional naturalist who documented every species, every habitat relationship, every environmental condition on this island?" Webb's confidence flickered slightly. "I'd be interested in reviewing any relevant scientific data." Maren picked up one of the thick folders from her grandfather's collection. This folder contains documentation of 14 rare plant species that use this island as their primary habitat. This one shows migration patterns for birds that depend on the island as a critical rest stop during their journeys between breeding and wintering grounds. And this one details the aquatic ecosystem that surrounds the island, a nursery area for juvenile fish populations that support commercial fishing throughout this section of Lake Michigan. She opened another folder. Soil composition studies showing how the island's unique geological structure creates microclimates that don't exist anywhere else in the region. Botanical surveys documenting plant communities that have evolved in isolation for thousands of years. Water quality data demonstrating how the island's natural filtration systems maintain clarity and chemical balance in the surrounding lake area. Webb was no longer smiling. Ms. Brooks, I appreciate your grandfather's hobby research, but professional environmental assessments would take decades to replicate the data in these files, Maren interrupted, and would cost millions of dollars to conduct with this level of detail and consistency. Mr. Webb, your company's restoration protocols might meet regulatory minimums, but they cannot restore an ecosystem that has taken millennia to develop. She walked to the window and looked out at the boulder, where Scout had taken up his protective stance. My grandfather knew about the copper deposits for 60 years. He had dozens of opportunities to profit from them. Mining companies have been approaching him since the 1960s. Do you know why he never sold? I assume financial considerations, because he understood that some things are worth more than money. Maren returned to the table and picked up the final document she had. Discovered in her grandfather's research chamber, a legal deed that she had saved for this moment. Mr. Webb, I'd like you to review this document before we continue our discussion. The deed was thick, professionally prepared, and bore the seals of multiple legal authorities. Webb read it quickly, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. This appears to be an environmental protection deed, he said carefully. Filed with the state of Michigan 6 months ago, Maren confirmed. It establishes Birch Island as a private nature preserve, with permanent restrictions on commercial development. The deed specifies that mineral extraction, logging, construction, and any other activities that would substantially alter the island's natural state are permanently prohibited. Sarah grabbed the document from Webb's hands. That's impossible. Grandpa never mentioned any environmental protection deed because he wanted to give me the choice, Maren replied. The deed includes a clause that allows the current owner to void the environmental protections within the first year after inheritance, but only if they provide scientific evidence that development would serve a greater environmental good than preservation. Webb's professional composure was beginning to crack. Miss Brooks, I don't think you understand the financial implications of what you're saying. You're talking about walking away from generational wealth. No, Mr. Webb, I'm talking about preserving generational wealth that can't be measured in dollars. Daniel stepped forward with desperation creeping into his voice. May I be reasonable? You can't throw away this opportunity for some romantic notion about protecting a pile of rocks and trees. I'm not protecting rocks and trees, Daniel. I'm protecting a living system that supports dozens of species and contributes to the health of the entire Great Lakes ecosystem. I'm protecting scientific research that documents how natural systems function when they're left undisturbed. I'm protecting something that my grandfather spent 60 years of his life studying and preserving. Scout moved from his position by the window to stand beside Maren, his presence solid and reassuring. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Loyalty, protection, and the kind of steadfast commitment that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Webb closed his briefcase with sharp, angry movements. Ms. Brooks, you're making a serious mistake. Opportunities like this don't come around twice. You're right, Maren replied. The opportunity to destroy something irreplaceable only comes around once. As Webb and her family filed out of the cabin, their voices carrying across the water in frustrated conversation, Maren remained by the window with Scout at her side. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. And for the first time since her grandfather's death, she felt completely at peace with her inheritance. She had chosen true north over their maps, preservation over profit, wisdom over wealth. The island would remain exactly as her grandfather had left it, a sanctuary where natural systems could flourish without human interference, a living laboratory where future generations could study and learn from the intricate relationships that made life possible. The copper would remain beneath the boulder, waiting patiently as it had for thousands of years. But the true treasure, the knowledge, the ecosystem, the sacred trust between generations, would continue to grow and flourish in the island's perfect solitude. 6 months later, Maren sat at the same wooden table where her grandfather had conducted his research, writing in a new leather journal that had become her most treasured possession. The morning sun streamed through the cabin windows, illuminating pages filled with her own careful observations about the island's seasonal changes, its wildlife patterns, and the subtle signs that marked the transition from winter's grip to spring's gentle awakening. March 15th, she wrote in handwriting that was beginning to resemble her grandfather's patient, measured script. First robin sighting of the season, nest building in the East Birch Grove. Scout located 3 new wildflower shoots near the boulder. Species appear to be trillium, possibly the rare white variant that Grandpa documented in 1987. Water temperature up 2 degrees from last week's readings. Ice breakup proceeding on schedule. Scout dozed contentedly by the wood stove, his grey muzzle resting on crossed paws. The winter had been gentler than expected, though Maren had prepared for isolation by stockpiling supplies and upgrading the cabin's heating system. But instead of feeling trapped by the lake's frozen surface, she had discovered a profound peace in the island's winter solitude. The months of snow and silence had given her time to absorb her grandfather's research, to understand the intricate relationships he had documented, and to begin her own contributions to the island's scientific legacy. Her phone, now used primarily for emergency communication and weekly check-ins with mainland friends, buzzed with an incoming call. Tom Whitehorse's name appeared on the screen, and Maren smiled as she answered. "Good morning, Tom. Perfect timing. I was just about to make another pot of coffee. Morning, Maren. Just checking in after the ice breakup. You and Scout make it through the winter all right?" "Better than all right. We thrived," Tom chuckled, the sound carrying warmth and approval. "I figured you would. Your grandfather always said this island had a way of teaching people what they really needed to know about themselves." They talked for a few minutes about the weather, the fishing prospects, and the subtle signs that marked spring's arrival in the Great Lakes region. But before ending the call, Tom's tone grew more serious. "Had an interesting conversation with your brother Daniel last week. He stopped by the marina, asking questions about boat access to the island." Maren felt a familiar tension. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggested he might be planning another visit. But when I told him about the environmental protection deed and the research station you've established, he seemed to lose interest pretty quickly. Mentioned something about wasted opportunities and drove off looking like a man who'd swallowed something sour." After the confrontation 6 months ago, Maren's relationship with her family had fractured along predictable lines. Daniel and Sarah remained furious about her selfishness and had cut off all communication, apparently viewing her choice as a personal betrayal that had cost them millions of dollars. Mark had initially tried to maintain neutrality, but eventually sided with his siblings when it became clear that no amount of pressure would change Maren's mind. But not all family bridges had burned. Her cousin Jennifer, who had remained quiet during the cabin confrontation, had called a month later to apologize for her participation in the intervention attempt. A few other relatives had reached out over the winter, expressing respect for her decision and curiosity about her grandfather's research. These conversations had been tentative but genuine, offering hope that some family relationships might eventually heal. The island had attracted attention from unexpected quarters as well. Word of her grandfather's extensive ecological documentation had spread through environmental research networks. and Maren had received inquiries from universities interested in accessing the data for their own studies. She had been careful about these requests, following her grandfather's example of sharing information only with researchers whose motives aligned with conservation rather than exploitation. The Michigan Nature Conservancy had also reached out, offering support for her preservation efforts and proposing a partnership that would provide scientific oversight while maintaining her ownership and control of the island. The conversations were ongoing, but Maren appreciated having allies who understood the value of what she was protecting. Most importantly, she had begun developing her own vision for the island's future. The cabin was being gradually expanded to include a proper research station with equipment that would allow for more sophisticated environmental monitoring. She was documenting climate change impacts that her grandfather had only begun to observe, tracking species migrations that seemed to be shifting in response to warming temperatures, and noting changes in water quality that reflected broader environmental pressures on the Great Lakes. Her new journal contained not just scientific observations, but personal reflections on the transformation she had undergone since arriving on the island. The woman who had fled to this sanctuary 6 months ago, burned out, recently divorced, questioning her life's direction, felt like a different person entirely. April 2nd, one entry read, "Realized today that I haven't thought about my old consulting job in weeks. The work that once consumed my days, writing environmental impact reports that everyone ignored, documenting destruction that no one prevented, seems like someone else's life now. Here, the environmental work feels meaningful because it's connected to preservation rather than mitigation of damage already planned." Another entry, written during a February snowstorm, reflected on deeper changes. "Scout and I spent the evening by the fire, listening to the wind and watching snow accumulate on the windows. 6 months ago, this silence would have felt lonely. Now it feels like completeness. I understand what Grandpa meant about the island teaching patience. Not just the patience to observe and document, but the patience to let life unfold at its natural pace instead of forcing it to match our expectations." The journal had become more than a research log. It was a record of healing, of discovering purpose that aligned with values rather than external expectations. Every page documented not just the island's seasonal cycles, but her own process of becoming the person her grandfather had believed she could be. As spring progressed into early summer, Maren established new routines that honored both scientific observation and personal reflection. Morning walks with Scout to check monitoring equipment and document changes in vegetation. Afternoons spent analyzing data and updating the research files that would someday benefit future scientists. Evenings devoted to reading, writing, and simply existing in harmony with the island's natural rhythms. The copper deposits remained undisturbed beneath the boulder, their presence now feeling more like a guardian's secret than a missed opportunity. Sometimes, when the afternoon light struck the great rock formation at just the right angle, Maren could see the metallic veins that hinted at the wealth below. But instead of regret, she felt satisfaction, the deep contentment that came from choosing preservation over profit, wisdom over wealth. Her grandfather's compass still sat on the cabin's main table, its brass surface polished to a warm glow. The inscription, "True North," had become her personal motto, a reminder that moral direction remained constant even when external pressures tried to pull her toward easier paths. On quiet evenings, she would often read passages from her grandfather's journal alongside her own entries, noting the continuity of purpose that connected their observations across generations. His voice spoke to her from those pages, gentle, patient, wise, confirming that she had made the right choice and encouraging her to continue the work he had begun. June 21st, her newest entry concluded. "Summer solstice, longest day of the year. Scout and I watched the sunset from the boulder, grateful for another day in this place that has taught us so much about what really matters. The island continues to reveal its secrets slowly, patiently, trusting us to be worthy guardians of what we discover. Tomorrow I begin documenting the midsummer bird populations, continuing Grandpa's 60-year survey and adding my own small contribution to the island's scientific legacy. Some treasures grow more valuable when they're preserved rather than harvested. Some inheritances are measured not in dollars, but in the wisdom to recognize what cannot be bought. As darkness settled over Lake Michigan and the first stars appeared in the clear northern sky, Maren closed her journal and prepared for another peaceful night in the sanctuary her grandfather had preserved and passed on to her. Scout stirred by the wood stove, lifting his head to regard her with eyes that reflected perfect contentment with their shared solitude. Outside, the great boulder stood silent vigil over secrets that would remain hidden, treasures that would continue growing in value precisely because they would never be sold. The island's true wealth, its pristine ecosystem, its scientific legacy, its capacity to heal and teach, would endure for generations yet to come, protected by the simple recognition that some things are worth more than money, and some choices define not just our lives, but our souls.